Today our guests are two archaeologists, Aaron Gore and Daniel Mazot, both co-founders and owners of Beverwyck Archaeology. They've done some work out here at the Yates Mansion on trying to date the house and to figure out when the house was built and what life was like here on the Yates property. So I don't know who wants to start, but you know, one of the big conventional wisdoms out there is that this house, in fact our plaque says it, was built in 1734. You don't necessarily think that's accurate, correct?
Correct. So one of our first goals here with the archaeology was to corroborate that date or find evidence to the contrary. So our earliest excavations here were units that targeted the foundation, looking for cultural material that would, what we call diagnostic cultural material, that would be useful in assessing the date of the building of the foundation. What we did find in some of the deeper deep units were fragments of ceramic called creamware. And creamware is or was produced between 1760 and 1800. It wasn't produced before that, and we found some of those pieces almost directly associated with the foundation. So the building couldn't have been built before 1760. The large majority of ceramics that we did find in association with the foundation was creamware and another variety called, or another ceramic type called pearlware. Pearlware dates from 1780 to 1820. And those two types of ceramics make up roughly 3/4 of the ceramic assemblage that we found in association with the foundation. Later survey of the site, we find later ceramics and not those earlier ones. So the majority of the early stuff we're finding is in association with the foundation, and pretty firmly roots the building of that foundation to that time period.
In addition to that, there was a historian from the State Historic Preservation Office who did come over and did an architectural assessment, and a correct one, I think, that describes the building as a federal style building. It has all the classical elements of a federal building, the window placement, design, door, entryway, and all that kind of stuff. So characteristics certainly not consistent of a early 18th century structure, but rather a later federal structure.
So one of our earlier historians, Pearson, had indicated that the home was built probably in 1734, 1737. He never really had any documentation to that or cited the reason why he believed that was the case, but it was clear that in some of the earlier writings about the home that they dated this being built 1730s or so. Unfortunately, it wasn't unusual for a 19th century, early 20th century historian not to document their work, but it kind of leaves us with the question, why did he feel that, and why was it originally dated incorrectly by almost 60 years?
That's a really good question, and an interesting one. It brings up actually a really interesting question regarding historical research as a whole. Being a historian is sort of like being a detective, and you rely on different types of evidence to build your argument, your case, or whatever. So that Pearson reference that you just made was, his book was in 1883, I believe. It was the History of Schenectady Patent. This is the first that I can recall that mentions Joseph Yates as being the first person of the Yates family to come out to Schenectady. Beyond that, we don't have any firm evidence about that particular date. He does also mention that his eldest son, Christopher, was born here in 1737, a few years later, which adds a little more credence to it. But we don't have anything firm from him. The first bit of real evidence we do have about when Joseph owned the property is from two deeds, from both dated in 1751, that reference Joseph Yates as owning land on the west side of the Alplas. Both of them are from Arent Bratt, who was the last surviving trustee of the Donegan patent, the 1884 Donegan patent, who sold lands to a guy by the name of Derek Van Voorst and another gentleman, Johannes Vroman. And in both of these deeds reference the lands of Joseph Yates. So for instance, the Vroman deed, I think, says something like, it's at the corner of Joseph Yates' land. So those two things we know for sure. provide the first real bits of evidence for Joseph owning the property. So combine that with Pearson's claims of 1734, and the harder evidence from 1751. It's pretty certain that sometime in that time period, between 17 years or so, it was when he purchased the land.
So if we're tracing this property back to its original purchase, when the Yates family received it, probably 1730s, any thoughts or ideas on how they originally, or who they originally purchased the property from? Obviously this was part of the commons, oftentimes on the north side of the Mohawk early years. Those lots were sold off in large chunks to wealthy families for farming, and so perhaps the Yates could have purchased it from a Schenectady trustee or the trustees, or there's some thought that originally Joseph Yates purchased it from the Stevens family, which was one of the families here on this road, just about a half mile down or so. Any thoughts or information you might have on that?
So Jonathan Stevens was a really interesting character, actually. He was a New Englander by birth, moved to the region around early 1690s, I believe, married a Mohawk woman by the name of Leah, I think, who was a widow of an earlier settler. And he leased a couple of farms in the 1690s in the area before buying actually 3 plots of land in the early 18th century directly from the Schenectady patent trustees. He was a farmer, and he also served as an interpreter, which is kind of interesting. He's a pretty interesting guy. So we know that in the early 18th century, Stevens owned what they say is hundreds of acres of woodland on the west side of the Alplos, really nice geographic marker. And we don't have any evidence of anyone owning the property between Jonathan Stevens and his sons and Joseph Yates in the 1750s. So again, it's not really super firm evidence, but it's fairly solid that and fairly certain that Joseph Yates had his purchase from one of the Stevenses.
So this house, as we understand now, was not built in 1734. This house actually has 3 components to it, and we'll get into those later additions, the east wing and the west wing. But let's take the core center house that is the original house. What date do you put on that, Daniel, as far as being built?
Somewhere between 1790 and 1810. Thereabouts. A lot of the artifacts suggest that. The research we've done so far on deeds and the movement of the house through the family for the property, it's pretty firmly in that period. The federal style, when did that become prevalent? Like 1760s, 1770s?
Particularly after the Revolution.
Yes, and became very strong right after the Revolutionary War, and persisted through the early 1800s. But this house is very, like Aaron was saying, it's very quintessentially Federalist, and the artifacts match that. So based on, we use, when we start looking at the data, the artifact data, we look at the production ranges of ceramics, and some of us will use what are called mean ceramic dates, and that's like the midpoint of the production of a ceramic. And it gives you a ballpark figure, but the MCDs for the ceramic assemblages from the South Foundation were all, between, it was like 1801 to 1807. So, and that's a range, and it could have been a little bit early, it could be a little bit later, but that's what it's saying.
So that would have put the property in the hands of Ellis Yates.
Correct. Yeah.
And Ellis, we know, was a farmer.
Ellis was a farmer. He was an interesting character, actually. So Ellis was the second son of Joseph, the original settler. His elder brother, Christopher, was 7 years older. And when Joseph died, we actually don't really know for sure when Joseph Yates died. Again, like I said, there was a reference to him dying in the late 1740s, and then there's other references that suggest he was alive in the 1750s. Even if he died in the early 1750s, both of his 2 sons, Christopher and Ellis, were both minors still at that point. And he also died intestate, so we don't really know what his intentions were for his property. There's some circumstantial evidence that suggests that he split the property, the physical property, between his male heirs, which is pretty common thing to do. They would often leave property to the male heirs, and then the daughters of the family would get sort of cash, consolation prizes, as it were. bit of evidence that suggests that is in the 1792, there's a reference to Ellis actually selling half of a slave to the estate of his brother, to Christopher's estate, which suggests that they did split things at one point. The idea of obviously selling half a person is horrible, but in this instance it does suggest, again, circumstantial evidence, but evidence nonetheless, that they did split the property at that time. And
you said earlier the core house is federal.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard some people refer to it as Georgian, but I don't think there's any evidence of that.
I don't believe
And
so.
I don't know what period Georgian would be.
it's a little bit later, and there are some, potentially some elements, but those two styles do sort of overlap a little like anything else.
Do you see any Dutch influence on the federal, a Dutch twist on the Federalist style?
I'm definitely not an architectural expert, but I don't see any, and that's one of the interesting things that we might push that date back to the early to the turn of the 19th century. For instance, you mentioned the Stevens house down the road a little bit. That looks a lot more Dutch than this place does, or I should say did.
So Daniel, you said the house wasn't built in 1734, but clearly they had the property that early. Any theories on potentially the Yates being wealthy enough as a family? We know they lived in the stockade. We know they lived in Schenectady. And the lots in the city typically were too small to farm or to keep animals or to get any natural resources whatsoever. So the properties over here on the north side of the river in what was the 4th Ward, now the town of Glenville, were common lands for residents to come over and to either farm or to hunt or to take timber. Could the Yates have potentially purchased their own common area, but for their family, here in Glenville, 400 acres, and used it as resources until eventually one day they did build?
Yeah, it's entirely possible. One of the things we were looking for during the site survey and when we were doing the assessment of the foundation was to see if there's any architectural elements that would predate this house, any foundation they might have built off of or truncated when they were building. Unfortunately, we didn't find anything that would suggest it would go, there was an earlier building here. But that model, in terms of them living in the city and having this area as a pasture, as a resource area, is, it's a common, it's an easy supposition to make. Yeah.
And what's more, we're only on 2 acres right here, and the survey that we did was only this 2-acre property, and the Yates property at one point was, I think, upwards of 400. Mm-hmm. So there could have been houses or structures anywhere. Also, you have to keep in mind that Joseph Yates was described as being the largest slaveholder in the county during his tenure here, again, between 1730s and 1750s. So maybe Joseph lived in town, but where did all the slaves live?
Yeah. There would have been buildings here. They were probably perishable. They were probably built of wood.
And that was Albany County at the time, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, so that's even bigger county, more populated county, just
Yeah.
Schenectady County. So that speaks to his potential wealth.
Yeah, and large-scale agricultural production here then too.
Right. They do refer to it as a plantation.
Yeah.
Which is not something we normally hear up in the north.
Right. And then as you move into the 18th century, into the 19th century, you see the decrease in slave ownership, and they start selling off chunks of the land, and I think you could probably say that fortunes shifted. Reversed.
Absolutely. Ellis, for instance, so this would be Joseph's son, only owned 3 slaves. 1790 census, 1800 census, both list him as having only 3 slaves. So, John Sanders, who lived up the road at the time in either 1790 or 1800, owned 14 by contrast. So, their dubious distinction as being the largest slaveholders in the county was no longer the case.
So some of the challenges you've had with the archaeological dig on site is also some of the elements and what's been removed. And just speak a little bit about that. Yeah,
so there's been a lot of change to the property over the years, from when the house was built, but also through the 20th century. That's impacted the archaeological record in terms of just looking at the soil and how it's been disturbed. And at some point before 1968, between 52 and 68, they built a pool in the back. that removed a huge footprint of land. It's been filled in, and associated with that was a concrete pad, foundation for it, and associated like small structures. There's an extensive driveway system here. At some point during the late 20th century, there was two active parking lots for when this building, I believe, was a law firm or housed a law firm in 80s or 90s or so, and then was a multifamily housing before the town acquired it. Those lots, they cover, a fair amount of square footage, but they also impact the topography of the site. So what you have, this house rests on kind of like a natural swell, and it's would have originally gently sloped down from it, but you can see in these lots as you walk around outside that they leveled it. And we saw that when we were doing our survey along this drive south of the house. When they put the driveway through, they probably extracted a fair amount of fill from next to the house and redeposited on the other side to flatten it. I think the same probably happened out on this side as well. And then there's also the issue that's kind of stifled our survey is the issue of the contraction of the property lot. So right now it's 2.06 acres, I think. Prior to some point between, I'm not sure when that property was, the barn behind the house, that's now a private residence, was originally part of this lot. And some point between 1982 and 2001, that it was sold off. I don't know the exact date of it, but I'm going off aerial photography. Mm-hmm. So the removal of that section, the barn would have had a number of associated outbuildings as well that probably would have been closer to it. We lost a fair amount of space where things would have been. Middens in particular was what we were hoping to find. And those middens are what, they are artifact deposits that are created by the discarding of trash. Mm-hmm. So it's often domestic trash. You have ceramics and more importantly, faunal material, like things they ate, kitchen bone, and that can be used to look at issues of wealth, especially if you see changes in what they're eating, the cuts of meat they were eating, and you see that over time. You can look at like issues of wealth and increasing wealth, their diet, health, all that, those topics. But where we found some scant faunal material, nothing like a nice solid refuse dump. Yeah. One of the issues too, though, is that there's a gully right to the side of the house. And I'm of mind that perhaps they were discarding a lot of trash down that, but part of it's very steep. That material would have fallen downhill into the base of it.
Joseph C. Yates lives here, is what our sign says and what everybody has believed for years. What do you say to that?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, right? The short answer is no. There's no evidence that he lived here. He certainly not as an adult. There is potential that he may have worked here as a teenager on his father and uncle's farm when they owned it jointly after his grandfather Joseph died. However, by 1806, actually, I backtrack that a little bit. Joseph C. was born in 1768. He became mayor, the first mayor of Schenectady, I believe, in 1798. So we know that he wasn't living here after 1798, and certainly by 1800 and into the 19th century, Ellis was firmly the owner. The only period that he could have potentially owned it to any extent was the time period between the death of his grandfather, the death of his father, Christopher, and when Ellis acquired it in total, sometime between 1785 and 1800. He may have shared ownership to some extent with Ellis. But there's also this great local story, a family story about when Christopher died, how Ellis, this would be Joseph C.'s uncle, wanted Joseph to come out and work on the farm, essentially put his labor toward the farm, and then Joseph C.'s mom, Yanicha, said, no, Joseph's going to go to school. So probably he wasn't working on the farm after 1785. So it's unlikely that he owned it in any real sense. He may have visited in the early 19th century when either Ellis or Ellis's son, Andrew, owned it. But no evidence that he actually lives here.
But he may have visited.
He may have
It's
worked.
entirely possible.
Yes.
Yeah.
Probable, I'd say.
Yeah.
So really this challenges the notion that this was a summer residency for a wealthy gentleman who became a governor. They call it the Yates Mansion. Really more likely accurate term would be the Yates farmhouse.
Correct.
Agricultural use.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly Yellis's son, Yellis died in 1812. His son Andrew inherited the property and held it up until the 1840s. Some interesting things happened in the 1840s and 1850s, but by then Joseph C. was dead. But in any case, it was most certainly a farm. There's a agricultural census from the 1850s when Andrew owned the property that describes it as being a 150-acre farm, of which I think 120 acres were improved. So not only was it a farm, it was a fairly big one, even then, with a lot of acreage under cultivation. And there is a sense of, not necessarily of steady decline, there's a lot of up and down. Even Andrew in the 1820s, you look at the 1822 tax records, between 1822 and 1828, for instance, he actually, his net worth went up, and the farm had gained 100 acres in that time period. But that being said, Andrew and his son, Andrew, of course, because these people like to repeat their names, did seem to experience some difficulties after the 1840s. You see them selling off more chunks of land, you see them taking loans. In fact, when the land is ultimately sold out of the Yates family to a gentleman named Joseph Birch, part of the agreement is that Birch agrees to essentially take on some of the payments of these lawsuits that Andrew had against him from his own sisters, actually, for not paying them money from their father's will.
His family with Joseph Birch in the 1860s or so?
1858, I believe.
1858.
Yep.
He has it for?
Until 1900.
1900, yep. And then it goes into the governor's?
No, actually. So between 1900 and 1922, it's a property of this guy named Peter Hoag, who his obituary, which I think was from the 1830s, or sorry, 1930s or 40s, I don't remember. His obituary describes him as a doctor in life who, after he retired, moved out here and became a scientific farmer. He was interested in scientific farming. And if you look at a lot of local newspaper records from the early 1900s, you see a lot of references to Peter Hoag looking for farm help. So it was an active farm by that point. In 1919, things are starting to change a little bit. He's advertising to sell building lots, to sell pieces of the land off. And it's not until 1922, when he sells the land actually to the Delaware and Hudson Railroad, that it becomes the governor's inn, as it's called.
The entire land went to the Delaware?
Yeah, it looks that way. It seems unbelievable.
So
and bizarre.
how's it get back?
So what happens between 1922 and 1922 and 1942? It's the property of the Delaware and Hudson Railroad. They certainly didn't seem interested in developing it in any way, so they allowed, but they did allow a woman initially, a woman named Evelyn DeCamp Porter, to open this Governor's Inn, which opened in 1922 as a place for events and things like that. And then again, that's in 1922. It remains in her hands up until the late 1930s, at which point ownership transfers to a couple, Hans and Maria Freyer of Miami, who own it and operate it as the Governor's Inn up until 1943. At that point, actually 1942, the Delaware and Hudson Railroad Company sells it to a guy by the name of Ralph Kruger, who only holds it for about a year. And during his brief tenure, it also seems to still remain as the Governor's Inn under the ownership and management of this Freyer family. In 1943, there's a newspaper article describing a big auction in which they're selling off all the things from the Governor's Inn. Not only the chairs and the tables and all that kind of stuff, but also a lot of farm accoutrements. There's horses, there's saddles, there's bits, there's bridles, and all that stuff in these things, which suggests that not only was it still an inn, but there was some sort of farming-esque activity going on. Maybe it was for show, maybe it was just for horses and riding. Don't really know.
The house itself, there's been a lot of folks in the chain of ownership, but the house itself has gone through some changes. We have three components of the house. Maybe talk about the east wing and the west wing, and when they were put on, and maybe their architecture a little bit.
Well, the East Wing is very clearly a Victorian period, Queen Anne style, you say? Yeah. And that was probably built in the 1880s, give or take, when that style becomes very popular. And you can see, it's very distinctual, a lot of angles, and you can see it in the front of this house. You have the flat face of the Federalist House, and then it bows out into like a bay, non-90-degree angles. It was this more textured style of architecture, I guess you can say. And the second edition was the West Wing, which was built in the, I believe, the early 1920s in association with this, and I don't know, I don't really know what else to say about that.
Yeah, that was advertised in when the opening of the Governor's Inn was advertised in the Schenectady Gazette in the 1922. I don't remember the date exactly, but it was 1922. It does describe Mrs. Porter, the owner of the inn, as putting on this wing for use as a tea room for the inn. So it had a very specific function. And going back to this East Edition, like Dan was saying, it's very traditionally Victorian. That bay window is very, very classic. And it also sort of corresponds to the sort of cultural or social movement called the cult of domesticity at the time. The idea of keeping up with the Joneses and keeping a beautiful house and having a parlor and all that kind of stuff is right in line with that sort of social movement that was going on, that the Birches were clearly, very clearly part of.
1790, 1810, whenever this was put on, if you look around, someone who would have built this house would have had considerable wealth. It would have been considered a substantial house in that period.
I think so. I mean, we're not talking ostentatious amounts of wealth, but yes, I mean, the material is certainly built to last. These are all handmade bricks. That's not a cheap thing to make to have bricks made by hand for your house.
The impacts in this area I want to talk a little bit about was the Erie Canal. We see the Erie Canal start to come into play about 1822, 1824, ironically while Joseph Yates is governor. Joseph Yates, I believe, was originally opposed to public money being used for the canal. But do you see any impacts the canal may have had on this farm?
The canal got going in the 1820s, essentially, and that also kind of marks the period in the Yates history where things are starting to get a little bit worse for the Yates. Not so much in the 1820s itself. There was a slight sort of increase, as I mentioned before, about the tax records and the acreage. But after that, into the 1830s and 1840s, things actually started to get worse for the Yates.
At a point where the Erie Canal would have been providing wealth to those who could tap into it.
Right, a great outlet for a huge mega farm, essentially.
Especially in the first couple decades of the canal, when it was like, it was economy.
Right.
Aaron, you've talked a little bit, or you mentioned to me a little bit of a rift you uncovered potentially mid 1800s here between the two Yates boys, and it may have led to the demise of the property being in the Yates hands. Joseph Birch purchased this just slightly after that. Talk a little bit about that.
That was an interesting, that was in the 1850s. Evidence of some sort of family feud going on where when Andrew Jr., who oddly is named Andrew Jr., even though his father was not named Andrew, but he did have an older cousin, I believe, who was named Andrew. When he died, he left the property to his two sons, Andrew and Henry VF. These two, it seems like they had a falling out, because at one point, Andrew was in full possession of the property. And then in April of 1856, he sold the land, the farm, to his sister, Helen Carner, her name was Helen Carner at the time. She married Jacob Carner, who owned the farm next door, for $800, 147 acres, I believe, $800. 2 days later, the Carners sell the same farm, the same 147 acres, the same $800 price tag, back to Andrew's brother, Henry VF. So for some reason, Andrew was not keen on selling it to his own brother, but would sell it to his brother-in-law, and then they would turn around and sell it to Andrew's brother. Interesting.
One of the exciting finds I think you guys did have was the sickle here on the property. You've presented that, and it definitely looks old. I know you haven't dated it yet, but kind of apropos, we have a sickle in our logo, and it's kind of interesting that you found the sickle here. And I wonder if you know, the Yates were growing broom corn here. We don't know much about their crop. We don't know much about what they actually did here as far as what they grew, but potentially the gentleman on the logo could be Ellis Yates himself cutting his broom corn. And I just think it's fascinating that we found that sickle, and talk a little bit about that.
That's an area where we think active agriculture happened. It looks like there's a plow zone in that area. So if they were growing corn here, it would have been, that area is a very good, you know, likely suspect for it, and this is what we found there.
What we learned here today after talking to Daniel and Aaron is that this home could not have been built prior to 1790. Using physical evidence they found in their dig, they're able to date the home to about 1790-1800. We also learned that this was not in the line of Joseph C. Yates, the governor, but it was the home of Ellis Yates, his uncle, and his family that actually farmed the property. This clearly questions what we thought we knew from earlier historians about this house and this property. But does everybody agree? In part 2 of this series, we'll talk to our architect, Frank Gilmore of SRG Architects. He and his team have been working on ways of dating this house based on the materials that were used and architectural styles for the time. Join us for the second part of the series as we hear from Frank and get a take on what he believes is the original date of the home and what this house was used for. Thank you for joining us. I look forward to seeing you in episode 2.